Thank you, Deanne. It's my pleasure to introduce our special guest speaker, who is actually the lead speaker for today, Asaf Reindel of Friedman Kaplan. Friedman Kaplan is a US based law firm which we have known them for more than 20 years, or 20 at least around 20 years or so. We have known Asaf for a very long time, and we know that he's a great lawyer, and he has very good thoughts on some of the topics which we are discussing. So which is where I would want today. That's why we invited Asaf and Friedman to join us for our cCep webinar today. Asaf is partner with Friedman Kaplan, and he is one of the senior partners. He has been leading this space for a long time, and I really look forward to seeing Asaf talk on this subject. Uh, let me let me uh, let me start by introducing this subject. Asaf and I, we were talking about doing something together, and Asaf actually uh, told, why don't we talk about the phasing out of Libor and the effect it has on all the international agreements. And I thought that is this an idea where Indian audience will be kind of interested in? Do we use Libor? And when I was doing some research, I found that Libor is a big issue internationally, and for some reason it has not caught up the attention of Indian companies. So and since we do a lot of international transactions, and where we have used Libor, and personally I have used Libor many times in the past, many years ago, and I know some of those contracts and agreements are still valid. So it is interesting and important for us to kind of visit what will be the implication of Libor being phased out, and also see what we should be doing, which is where I thought Asaf can shed a light on. Um and I would like to invite Asaf, if he can kind of give a little background on Libor, why it is being phased out, what is being replaced with, and what is the implication, and what should companies actually look out for at this point in time. So Asaf, over to you. I don't want to take a lot of time. I want you to, I want you to kind of give your experience and your wisdom to this audience.
Thank you, Vaibhav, and hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to do this with you guys, and we know the Nishith Desai law firm for many years, as you noted. I know some of you for many years, so it really is a great pleasure. And I will be talking about Libor transition. So just to mention, we're a New York-based law firm, and I'm, in this capacity, I'm a member of our Libor Transition Task Force, which is a cross practice group that we formed to help clients prepare for the transition away from Libor, and to bring and prepare transition-related claims. So why don't we start with just briefly on the basics of what is Libor. And Libor represent the average interest rate that the bank would be charged by other banks for an unsecured loan for a particular term in a particular currency. There are 5 currencies, there are various terms, right? 3 months, 6 months. You can't talk about Libor just in itself. You have to, there's always a term involved. It can be overnight, it could be 1 year, etc. Until recently, Libor was determined on the basis of daily submissions by banks based on their estimates of what they would be charged by other banks. That methodology has been updated to use a waterfall that favors actual transactions. But as we'll discuss in a minute, there's actually not a lot of transactions underlying Libor, so it's still in large part based on estimates and submissions by a panel of banks. Libor is everywhere. It's been dubbed the most important number in the world. An estimated $370 trillion in financial contracts around the world. Over 200 trillion are U.S. Libor referencing transactions, and that's 10 times U.S. GDP. So the numbers are huge, and Libor really is everywhere. As you can see here, loans, derivatives, bonds, car loans, student loans. So it's really everywhere where you might or might not expect it. So once we know what Libor is, and once you hear that it's going away, the first question is why? Why is it going away? And there are two major factors that are the reason, and they arose after the financial crisis. I should add, this is the financial crisis of 2008. So there's been a significant decrease in introductional term unsecured lending. So the underlying market of LIBOR, right, is diminishing significantly, and LIBOR got increasingly disconnected from its underlying market. It's just not a lot of interbank unsecured transactions. And related to that, and this is something you might have heard of, there's been large-scale manipulation scandals. And banks paid billions of dollars and were criminal charges and people sent in jail. And these two are related because when the rate is based on submissions and estimates and expert judgment and not on actual transactions, that creates grounds for manipulation, and that's what may have happened. So even though it's such a successful and popular rate, the regulators got increasingly uncomfortable with it. And in July of 2017, Andrew Bailey, then CEO of the UK Financial Conduct Authority, which is the regulator of LIBOR, announced that after the end of 2021, panel banks will not be compelled to continue these submissions. And they very clearly clarify later, this means everyone should assume that at the end of 2021, LIBOR is going away. It's going to stop. Is it actually going to stop? Maybe it will continue in some form. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what everyone should assume, and what regulators do urge everyone to assume, is that LIBOR is going to go away at the end of 2021, which is not, end of next year. Let's see some of the things that regulators have been saying about this upcoming event. I'll mention the ARC. This is the US, the committee in the US that was in charge of finding a replacement for LIBOR. The chairman of that committee describes it as Tom Whiff as one of the most pressing financial stability issues worldwide. Randall Quarles, chair of the Financial Stability Board, with sort of not so gentle warning, saying this moment many seem to take comfort in continuing to use LIBOR. It's familiar, it remains liquid, but history may not view that decision kindly. After LIBOR stops, it may be fairly difficult to explain to those who may ask exactly why it made sense to continue using a rate that you had been clearly informed had such significant risks attached to it. The SEC is paying close attention. It's a key risk that the SEC is monitoring. The SEC came up with guidance last year about disclosures, guiding the market to disclose material risks related to LIBOR with some details, favoring tailored rather than generic disclosure, updating those from time to time. And this is important guidance. I won't have time to get into that here, but if disclosure is irrelevant to you in any form, as a person making disclosure or due diligence, you should be familiarize yourself with the guidance. And finally, the GC of the New York Fed. This is a DEFCON 1 litigation event, if you've ever seen one. So this could result in significant disputes. And the more prepared you are, the less likely you are to find yourself in one. So the next question is, LIBOR is going away. What's going to be, what will replace LIBOR? And the answer may very well be, and increasingly likely to be, that there's not going to be just one rate that will replace LIBOR. The market may go with several rates. So we'll talk about some of them here. The one I'll focus on and is the rate that is recommended by regulators, by this committee I mentioned in the US, is SOFR, the Secured Overnight Financing Rate. Let me just mention, I will focus on the US and US dollar LIBOR. Here, there are other replacement rates around the world. In the UK, the replacement of choice for regulators and the market is adopting it is called SONIA, the Sterling Overnight Index Average. There's one in Switzerland, in Japan, in other places. So in the US, the recommendation was to go with SOFR. It's a new rate. It measures the cost of borrowing cash overnight, collateralized by US Treasury securities in the repo market. So we'll unpack that a little bit soon. So we'll talk about that one in a minute. The next one here, the US dollar ICE Bank Yield Index. So this is a rate that's proposed by ICE, which is the current administrator of LIBOR. It's designed to measure the yield at which investors are willing to invest US dollar funds in large internationally active banks on a wholesale unsecured basis over 1, 3, and 6 month period. Now, one advantage that this rate has over SOFR is that it reflects bank credit risk. SOFR is a risk-free rate. Again, we'll talk about it, but it does not reflect bank credit risk. Unlike LIBOR, LIBOR does reflect bank credit risk. When there is a financial crisis, at least one with a credit crunch, LIBOR is expected to go up because of the increased credit risk of the banks. SOFR is not going to behave that way, and that's a problem for some people. The ICE Bank Yield Index does reflect the credit risk. However, it has significant disadvantages. For one, it's not published yet. There's no guarantee it will be published, even though ICE does expect to publish it maybe later this year. It depends on some conditions. It's not recognized for hedge accounting. There's significant drawbacks to that, and possibly because of that, last year they came up with an update to the methodology whereby the index is determined by combining a term SOFR yield curve and a bank credit spread curve based on transactional data. So what they're trying to do is, again, this is just a proposal to combine the best of both worlds. SOFR with its robustness, we'll talk about it, in addition to a bank credit risk based on this bank yield index. So we'll see where that goes. And this is a rate that's worth monitoring. The third one here, Ameribor, or the American Interbank Offered Rate. And when I talk about the possibility that there will be several rates replacing LIBOR. That's one of the contenders. It's an overnight. It's based on overnight unsecured lending, mainly between smaller regional U.S. banks. It does reflect bank credit risk. Sorry, it's published by the American Financial Exchange. It's recently it got recognition from it complies with the IOSCO benchmark principles, which give it credibility. And interestingly, recently, the chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve Board was asked about it in Congress and about this particular rate. And he said, the ARC recommendation to use SOFR are voluntary, and market participants should seek to transition away from LIBOR in a manner that is most appropriate given their specific circumstances. So the regulators are not saying you have to use our recommended rate, which is SOFR. At the same time, he says, it may be appropriate for some institutions where it reflects their cost of funding, but it may not be a natural fit for many market participants. And that's true. A Maribor may be compelling to some, but it doesn't look like a rate that really can replace like everything LIBOR, even though it is based on transactions, and it looks like it's becoming increasingly popular. So, so it may be there for a segment of the market. If you were a borrower from a smaller regional U.S. bank in the future, you might see a Maribor in your document. It's good to be familiar with that one as well. And the last one here on the slide, zombie LIBOR or synthetic LIBOR. That's a scenario by which at the end of 2021, when the UK, the panel banks are no longer obligated to make LIBOR submissions, some of them may continue to do that on a voluntary basis. The important thing to note there is at that point, it's not going to be the same benchmark. It's not going to be the same as LIBOR, even though it may be called LIBOR. It's actually increasingly likely that that is going to happen, at least on a temporary basis. But because it's going to be submitted by fewer banks, it's expected to be more volatile, less certain. The UK Financial Conduct Authority is very likely to declare then or even sooner that LIBOR is no longer representative of its underlying market. And there could be, you can see kind of disputes about that. LIBOR continues in some synthetic form, but participants might argue about whether that's still LIBOR or not LIBOR, and it may depend on how LIBOR is actually defined in your document. So, this is far from being a magic solution, but it is a scenario that's increasingly possible, but it's not something people should rely on and say, oh, yeah, LIBOR will continue. So still assume LIBOR will end at the end of 2021. So let's talk more now about SOFR, because it is the benchmark that the ARC, the Alternative Reference Rates Committee, is recommended. This is a committee comprised of US Fed, New York Fed, market and private market participants. And they recommended this new rate. It's published on the New York Fed website for just over 2 years now, so it's fairly new. It will require a spread adjustment. If you replace LIBOR with SOFR, there will be a spread adjustment to adjust for the difference between SOFR and LIBOR. As I mentioned, it measures the cost of borrowing cash overnight collateralized by US Treasury securities. So it's based on secured transaction, and it's one big advantage, and the reason regulators like it is it's very robust. It's based on more than $1 trillion of overnight transactions in the repo market. However, it's very different than Libor. So if you think, oh, so when we see Libor, let's just say SOFR or SOFR plus spread. No, it's not going to work that way because these are very different benchmarks. And here are some of the key differences. So Libor, as we mentioned, is based on unsecured transactions, interbank unsecured lending, whereas SOFR is based on secured transactions, secured, repo in the repo market, secured by treasuries. As we mentioned, Libor reflects bank credit risk. Financial crisis, credit crunch, Libor goes up, SOFR might not go up, might go down, might stay the same. It doesn't reflect bank credit risk. And that's one big reason that those who don't like it. Libor is originally submission-based. Now there's a waterfall, as we mentioned, but it's still in large part based on submissions. SOFR, as we mentioned, transaction-based, a lot of overnight transaction. Libor has terms, right? 2 months, 3 months, 6 months Libor, etc. SOFR is an overnight rate. It is expected that term SOFR rates will be published, but there's no guarantee of that, and certainly no guarantee that it will be published before 2021. So currently it's still an overnight rate. You can use compounding and averaging, and there's proposed ways to use that to mimic a term rate, but it's not there yet. Libor is very old. It's been there since the late 60s. It's very popular. SOFR is new. SOFR has been there for just over 2 years, as we mentioned. And it doesn't help that there's this apparently sort of random volatility. Towards quarter, there's spikes towards quarter ends, year ends, even though we didn't see that last year, but the year before there was a spike. And the most prominent example, in September of last year, there was almost 3% spike overnight. So I copied the rates there. I mean, if you just look at those 4-day rates, you would think this is a very volatile benchmark. Now, this is not representative of how this rate behaves, but this kind of spike didn't help in making people comfortable with this rate. And part of the reason is it's based on supply and demand in the repo market. And as I mentioned, it will need a spread adjustment because it's just different than Libor. There are other issues I'll just touch on briefly. Mismatch, between cash markets and derivatives. So if you take a loan, you usually want to know your rate in advance, right? So if you use SOFR, for example, you can use that in 2 ways. You can use, so let's say you want to take 3 months loan, you have a 3 months term. You can use a SOFR average over the last 3 months. What was the average in the last 3 months? And let's use that as our rate. That's called an in advance calculation. Or you can wait those 3 months, and then at the end of the term, you calculate the average over those 3 months, and that's going to be the rate. But then you're not going to know your interest rate at the beginning of the term, only at the end of the term. Usually borrowers prefer to know the term in advance, and therefore, and the other approach is called the in arrears approach. So borrowers typically prefer the in advance approach. Problem is that the hedging instruments use the in arrears approach. So if you want to hedge this 3 months term loan, your hedging instrument is going to use the in arrears approach, while you're going to use the in advance approach. So that creates some mismatch and what's referred to as a basis risk between your loan and your hedging instrument. You can hedge for the basis risk, but that means that your hedging becomes more complex and more costly. So that's going to be one of the consequences of the end of Libor is that hedging may become more costly, at least for some type of instruments. And there's accounting and tax considerations that, if relevant, should be familiar with. There are guidance in the US. And the important thing to know there is, in addition to being familiar with them, they each come with a set of requirements and qualifications. So if you want to benefit from them, you need to comply. For example, you want to make sure if you switch from Libor to SOFR, it doesn't create, at least if you're a US tax person, it doesn't create a taxable event. If you make a substantial modification to a note, that might be a taxable event. So in order to avoid that, you might need to comply with all the requirements. So let's talk about the fallback provisions, meaning the contractual provisions that determine what happens when Libor goes away. So we talked about Libor. We know kind of why it goes away. We know a bit about the replacements and the issues related to them. So now we look more closely at the financial instruments themselves. And there's the distinction here between derivatives and non-derivatives or cash instruments. And there's also a distinction between new instruments that you may be entering into today and in the near future versus existing instrument or legacy instruments, mainly those that were entered into before July 2017, when it was announced that Libor is going to go away, because no one really contemplates Libor going away. I mean, at most, you may have a document that contemplated a temporary cessation of Libor, but not a permanent cessation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So in the derivatives market, ISDA, after consultation, is developing fallback provisions for inclusion in its standard definitions based on the compounded setting in arrears rates. I'm just talking about what in arrears means. And for once that's done, new derivative instruments will have that as part of their standard definition. For legacy derivative contracts, ISDA is working on and will publish a protocol with fallback provision to allow market participants to include the fallbacks within the Libor contracts if they so choose. So if you have a derivative product and you and your counterparty both signed into the protocol, then the protocol will determine what happens when Libor goes away. But if one of you did not do that, then you just need to deal with it with your counterpart. In the cash market, non-derivative instruments. So for new cash instruments, the ARC, the same committee that published they recommended SOFR as a replacement rate. And while they're urging market participants, don't use Libor anymore, just switch to something else, switch to SOFR, stop digging the hole. Stop adding, Libor instruments to this pile. At the same time, they recognize that people still enter into new products based on Libor. So they published recommended fallback provisions. And there are different set of provisions for different types of products. They've published fallback provisions for floating rate notes, syndicated loans, bilateral business loans, securitizations, ARMs, and there's a consultation on student loans. So just there you see, the complexity, because even when you want to address Libor going away and the regulators are giving you recommended fallback provisions, there's no one set for each. It's like different based on your instrument. And to add to that complexity, these fallback provisions, which you need to be familiar if you're entering into one of these products that have US Libor in them, they're not just meant to be, copy and paste into your document. They're made to be tailored and negotiated. So if you're a borrower, for example, you should you may want to negotiate that a little bit. The ARC, these provisions are pretty lender friendly, so you may want to push back on some of them and negotiate and tailor them to your deal. And just from practice, we do see that, just working on loans, people are not focusing on this, on LIBOR. Lenders want to lend, borrowers want to borrow, but once they become aware, oh, LIBOR is going away, do you want to address it? Everyone says yes. I haven't seen anyone not wanting to address it. You just need to be aware of these provisions, the fact that it's going away, and then address it. And then you may need to negotiate it. But what you definitely should not do is enter into a LIBOR instrument without with sort of the old fallback, which didn't really contemplate that permanent cessation. And the one other thing, in addition to looking at your fallback provisions, tailoring them to your deal and negotiating them, look at your other provisions. One thing we noticed is there are kind of boilerplate provisions, predominantly, one that says that that lenders can suspend LIBOR lending if they determine that LIBOR doesn't reflect accurately and fairly their cost of funding. So we noticed that not everyone is paying attention to that. That may conflict with the fallback provision. So you want to address that and think about your other terms in the document when you kind of incorporate the fallback provisions. And again, this is all for new cash products, new loans, new notes. The tougher category is the legacy products. Again, those are contracts that exist today, existed before 2017. Some of them may have existed for decades, and they still have LIBOR, and they continue beyond 2021. And some of them are very difficult, if not impossible, to amend, referred to as a tough legacy category. There's some regulatory focus, but less regulatory focus on that. So this is really on market participants to focus on and understand and know their exposure. Just, the best example is with floating rate notes, where, so for example, you may have an old kind of fallback provision that says if LIBOR is not available. So first you have to do a bank poll. You have to, the agent, the lender, picks up the phone and call banks to as a poll of their LIBOR rates. But it's widely acceptable at this point that once LIBOR is going to go away, no one's going to pick up that phone. The banks are not going to participate in those phones, so that's not a viable option. And so the next alternative is you use, these old fallback versions. Say you use the last LIBOR rate that was available, right? And that kind of contemplates LIBOR not being available for maybe a couple of days. So you use the last rate available. That's fine. But when LIBOR ceases permanently, what that does is you turn your floating rate note into a fixed rate note. So first, that's not what the parties to that note intended. And someone is going to win and someone is going to lose. There's going to be value shift. So that's not good for anyone. Well, it might be good for the winners, but you may not know in advance if you're going to be a winner or a loser. Now, if you want to fix that, if you want to amend that, in the US, it's typical that this kind of an amendment requires unanimous consent. And that's very tough or even impossible to obtain. We've seen one example like that where the American Money Management Group tried to amend its CLOs, and in 2 out of 5 tranches, there's one investor that objected. So they tried to introduce fallback provisions. That's failed. in part. In the UK, it's easier because typically you need 75% consent. But I just read today that that 7 billion of sterling notes have been shifted through consent solicitation from Libor to Sonia. Remember, that's the UK replacement. But there's still 50 billion of sterling of products that go beyond 2021. So even in the UK, it's difficult and it's expensive. But in the US, when you need 100% consent, it just may be impossible. So what is being proposed? And I said regulators are less focused, but they definitely understand the complexity and difficulty. And one thing that is being proposed in New York is legislation trying to address that issue for contracts governed by New York law. And the reason is many of the contracts, even if it's that are non-US contracts, the parties may have chosen New York law. But this is far from guaranteed. It's still early, in addition to just obtaining legislators' focus, especially in this time of pandemic and everything going on in the US. Even if it's adopted, there may be constitutional challenges. So this is not something that people should rely on, but it's sort of in the pipeline and may happen. This legislation in New York that may help, at least in some way. There's some early consideration of that in the UK as well, not as advanced as in the US. In the US, there's actually proposed legislation that the ARC recommended. In the UK, it's earlier than that, but they're starting to think about that kind of solution for these tough legacy instruments as well. So in the tough, the legacy general category, this is where it's really important for, depending on how relevant it is to you, but understand where your exposure is, understand your contract, understand what they say, what fallback provisions are there, if any, what can you do, should you do anything. So this is one of those aspects that really needs attention now. And as it says here, there's no one size fits all. It really depends on the detail of the instrument, of the transaction, of the parties. So let me briefly talk about what you can do. And this may not be, it is not relevant for in whole to everyone, but depending on how relevant it is to you, right? I mean, if you have one loan that has Libor in there, then you're in luck, and you look at that and you consider it and you consider what to do. But if you're, if you have more than that, and you need some more organized approach, and many people need that, the first step is probably to consider assembling a team, because this is sort of a cross-department effort. This is not just legal, it's not just tax, not just accounting, not just operations. It's possibly everything, and should be led by a senior person to have the authority to kind of move it forward. Conduct an inventory to find where Libor is located, not to say possibly hiding in your business. Libor might be in unexpected places. You might have a securitized product that governed by something else, but the underlying transactions that are securitized might have Libor. It might be 1 or 2 levels underneath. Find the documents. If you have many of those, consider an automated approach. There are solutions now who would, through machine learning or other ways, would digitize and scan your documents. It's important to have legal input alongside that, because you do need the legal input of thinking of what to search for. For example, you want to search for existing fallback, but depending on the instrument, you might, certainly want to look at how do you amend or terminate the instrument. What's the choice of law, right? What remedies do you have? So you need that legal background, but then you can use these sort of automated processes to help you with that process. And some people have millions of contracts. Develop a strategy for existing transactions and new transactions. We talked about loans a little bit. Identify them, consider amending them. Do you want to amend? Do you want to refinance? Do you want to approach the other side or not? But even if not, maybe you should just be prepared for the other side to approach you, asking for an amendment. For derivatives, should you adhere to the protocol? Be prepared for that. Identify transactions that cannot be amended, like the ones we discussed, securitizations, floating rate notes, at least in the US. Develop a strategy for those. Analyze the economic impact, because what should you switch to SOFR? Should you switch to something else? What's going to be good for you? What's going to be the impact on you if you do nothing? And consider acting now. Time is running out, and the more you wait, if it's relevant for you, the higher the risk, the clearer it's going to be if you're going to be a winner or a loser. And if you're going to be a loser when LIBOR goes away, it's going to be more difficult to amend the instrument. For new transactions, definitely include fallbacks and do it properly, as we discussed. Risk managers procedures, for example, should you limit new LIBOR products? Should you stop LIBOR products altogether? Should you use a fixed rate for now or some other rate? And again, this may not be relevant for everyone, but as relevant to you, if this, I touched on that, if disclosure is relevant, consider that. Be familiar with the SEC guidance here in the US, accounting and tax, understand the guidelines, and make sure you comply with the requirements so that you don't end up with a taxable event. Develop a plan, if relevant, to respond to regulators. In the US and the UK, they may very well be asking about it, and be prepared. If you're conducting due diligence on a fund, on whatever it is, think about LIBOR and ask about it. It may be material to the organization you're diligencing. And again, as relevant, update policies, systems, processes. If you're switching to a different rate, your systems might not handle the different rate because it's calculated differently, etc. So, those things take time. I think I've spoken a lot. That's all I have for now. I see any questions because I don't see the questions here for some reason. Maybe I'll see them in a minute, but I'll turn it over back to Vaibhav.
Thank you, Asaf. Really appreciate your insightful presentation. It is you covered it very, very comprehensive on, how LIBOR is, why LIBOR is getting phased out, what is the implication of LIBOR and what corporates should do, including tips for law firms and consultants when you are doing diligence on LIBOR. So thank you so much for very comprehensive, handling of this subject and including, the next steps what companies should look at. If people have any questions, I recommend that they kind of add up in the chat box right now so that we can address them. If it comes at a later stage, we will not be in a position to take up the questions. So, we appreciate that, if you do it on a timely basis, we will be able to address those questions. Now, we have understood from Asaf on the implications on LIBOR internationally. I've personally been working on a lot of contracts which I did earlier, which had LIBOR as a benchmark rate. Now I know it's less and less used as a benchmark rate, but then there could be contracts which may be out specifically the international contracts, whether it relates to ECB or whether it relates to investment funds, and which is why I thought I should go to Abhinav next and ask Abhinav on what is the implication of Libor issue, what Asaf talked about with respect to India. Where do you think things are going in respect to India?
So, Vaibhav, I think unfortunately, as you said, a lot of contracts, especially cross-border transactions, still use LIBOR as a very important benchmark. And it's a little unfortunate for me to say this, but compared to what Asaf dealt with in detail, it seems like India is lagging behind on the transition phase. We don't really seem to have a fixed plan of action as of yet. We haven't seen the regulators taking any action, and that might also be because of the fact that we benchmark our rates to a foreign currency rate as opposed to having a rate in our country on ourselves. However, we've seen no action from RBI, SEBI, or FIDI, which is a foreign exchange department, stating how the transition needs to work. In US, for example, not only are the regulators taking action, you also see some of the bodies like, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae pushing, MBS securities away from LIBOR altogether, or stating that they won't accept LIBOR after December 2020, which is an entire year before the actual phasing out of LIBOR. So the transition plan has started out much earlier, and I think it's going to move in a much better way because there will be time for transition. In India, as we've seen with any sort of major transition that happens, for example, recently, as we all know, the shift to NDAs, there has been a lot of time that has taken for the regulations to settle down, for the companies to come into terms with how the entire transition will work. And I think something similar will end up happening on the phasing out of LIBOR as well. We've seen the IBA, which is the Indian Bank Association, take steps towards it, appreciate the importance, and it's been trying to nudge banks. It's also been sending out letters to corporates to start taking actions with respect to LIBOR. It has formed subcommittees to see how it impacts rupee and non-rupee, rates that are used in India. For example, in India, we have a MIBOR or a MIFOR, which is the Mumbai Interbank offered rate or Mumbai Interbank future offered rate. Now, the MIBOR is something which is quite similar to what we have in other markets. But for example, MIFOR, which is one of the most widely used benchmark rates, is linked to LIBOR directly. So it takes a portion of LIBOR and it takes a portion of the for future or the forwards premium into computation. So with LIBOR going away, the entire computation for even the Indian exchange rates are going to see a change. Now, I think with respect to the Indian scenario, a lot of what Asaf said holds good here as well with respect to the what you should do and the transition plan. Now, I think what you should do is something that is very, very important because as Asaf mentioned that there is an entire regulatory framework in US coming up. This is also being used in other countries like Japan, Switzerland, Euro, UK itself, even Japan. Yeah, but in India we don't see that happening. And what I expect to happen is that as you were mentioning, a lot of the ECB, especially, which is the external commercial borrowings, were benchmarked to LIBOR rates globally. And a lot of these are in the infrastructure sector, which have extremely long gestation periods and extremely long tenure loans, which will continue way beyond 2021 in some cases as well. So I think it's going to be important for participants to start renegotiating them. As I think Asaf said, whether you have to start renegotiating them or you wait for the counterparty is one aspect. But at the end of the day, there has to be a renegotiation to bring in some sort of change to that regulation, to that contract. It's easier said than done at this point of time because there's no clarity on what benchmark to use. I think globally we are all moving towards different benchmark as FSB had originally contemplated as well. Having said that, are you going to have a situation where you have five different rates that you're going to benchmark if you're raising money from five different countries, for example? That's something that's still not very clear. And where does that ultimately end? The problem that we are also seeing with a couple of clients is that when there is a stalemate or there is a situation where the renegotiation or the amendment to the agreements don't reach a situation where it can go ahead, you look at refinancing ECBs. Or refinancing ECBs or external commercial borrowings is permitted only when the all-in cost ceiling of the new ECB is lower than that of the earlier ECB. All-in cost ceiling, as I think all of us know, is primarily the cost of the ECB. It includes various components, but at the end of the day, there is an all-in cost ceiling. Now, the all-in cost ceiling is similar to or higher to the earlier ECB. Refinancing requires regulatory approval. I think what could be very helpful at this point of time is a regulatory push to say that any sort of refinancing to match the earlier tenure of ECB, irrespective of how long that loan was, is going to be very helpful because that will provide the borrowers in India a chance or a possibility to move from a LIBOR benchmarking to another benchmark which can work for them. I think the bigger issue on this, honestly, Vaibhav, comes from a tax issue. A lot of the companies in India, which are multinational entities, which have global subsidiaries or holding companies, have intercorporate deposits. And till now, LIBOR has been an extremely accepted benchmark to do the transfer pricing studies, and everyone has linked them to LIBOR. Now, with LIBOR being phased out, it again opens up the same question that what benchmark do you ultimately link it to for conducting a transfer pricing study? And transfer pricing study also, relates to which currency you're borrowing in. So if you're borrowing in a yen, do you link it to the, Tonyo? If you're borrowing in USD, do you link it to SOFR? How does that work is something which no one is really clear on. And the amendment or the change of benchmark will give rise to will raise new concerns because transfer pricing studies which are undertaken upfront when borrowing takes into account the cost of capital for the entire tenure and transfer pricing studies have already been taken into account. Any change in that benchmark rate could raise new concerns that people may face. And right now, it's a very, very uncertain sort of a domain that we are dealing with. So it's unclear, but I think this is going to be interesting times for Indian companies to deal with ECBs and how they amend the existing terms. Vaibhav, I'm cognizant of the time and I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you, Abhinav. I think very interesting issues you raised, including tax issues as well as regulatory issues, and of course contractual and renegotiation issues. And I think if this thing don't tie up well, there may be litigation issues after 2021 from enforcement perspective and others. So this is something which for some reason India has not yet picked up. Maybe they don't see a big issue in this, or maybe this is just something which has slipped the mind of Indian corporates. But this is something definitely if something to check and make sure that the books are in order, the housekeeping is done properly, and there are no issues. It may turn out to be like Y2K, where it thought it was a big issue and it turned out to be a non-issue. But it is better to be safe and check out whether you have something which you should be doing right now, rather than wait till 2021 and then suddenly see the impact, which may be not so good from company perspective. With this, I would like to go to Richie and the other places where at least we have seen this LIBOR use is on investment fund side, especially internationally between, let's say, LP and GPs. In some situation, I would want Richie to kind of throw some light on what he is seeing and what is his thoughts on LIBOR affecting the investment funds.
Sure. Thanks, Vaibhav. I think insofar as LIBOR or any benchmarking sort of percentages are concerned, what we have seen is that for investment funds, there are three different scenarios in which this could have had some play. First one is preferred return. This is something that an investor or an LP would expect before they start sharing profits with the fund manager or the GP. So there, obviously, one of the incentives for somebody to participate in the fund is that, okay, had I sort of just parked my funds in a bank, then are you sort of beating those returns before I start sharing profits? So there we had traditionally seen use of LIBOR, 1-year LIBORs compounding annually, or a prime lending rate sort of compounding annually, and so on and so forth. But gradually we have seen a shift either to a fixed rate of return, like a 8% on a dollar basis, and so on and so forth. Or if it is a hedge fund we are talking about, then it could have been in a global context an S&P 500, or in Indian context a Nifty 50. So the hold of LIBOR or these sort of variable benchmarks has reduced on the preferred return sort of side. The second expectation on, or the second linkage, is with respect to equalizations. This concept sort of comes into play where you had a first closing of the fund with a bunch of investors coming in, and after some time a second set of investors participate in the fund, in which case from a concept of a true up, that okay, there was a time value to the money paid by the first close investors. How do you sort of true up the subsequent close investors? So there also, the cost of capital is a good way to measure the compensation to be paid out. But instead of again referring back to LIBOR or a variable benchmark there, uh, increasingly we have seen fund managers tying the equalization also to the preferred return offered by the fund, which, like I said, again has been inching more towards a fixed rate of interest rate approach. The third one is on defaulting investors or defaulting LPs, or those who sort of contribute on a slightly delayed basis. There again, the view was that, okay, the fund may have to borrow and access funds from commercial markets to sort of go ahead and make the investment, because of which the defaulting investors or those investors who paid with some delay are still on the hook. So there again, we have seen either a use of LIBOR plus 500 bips, or we have seen prime lending rates depending on which jurisdiction the fund has been set up and what is the benchmark borrowing rates in that jurisdiction. So I think interesting times, like Asaf said, that we'll have to look at where the documents are referring to LIBOR. In that case, is it going to be an easier conversation to change it to a different reference point? In case of defaulting contributors, definitely it should be easier. But if the preferred return itself is linked to LIBOR, then yes, these are going to be tough negotiations to have. Over to you, Weber.
Thank you, Richie. I know we are coming close to end of our time, but I would request, there are a few questions which I would like to take it up, and I would request to kind of extend this by a few minutes, if that's fine. And Asaf, the questions you can see in a chat box window. There's specifically Q&A marked. If you press Q&A, you can see the questions. So I don't know if you were able to look at the questions, but in any case, I will read out the questions for you. There are two questions, one by Namit and one by Naveen, which we have already answered during our discussion. That was on ISDA and on MIBOR and MIFOR, which we have already answered. So I will take the other ones. Rafiq has asked whether you can share the presentation. I understand that we are not sharing the presentation, but the recording of this webinar will be available after a few days on our website. So if you go to the recording, you can look at the presentation which was made by Asaf, and you can get all the information which we have. So you will have all the information later on, but we may not share the presentation to people. Then there is a question by Gaurav. This is an interesting question. What kind of work relating to LIBOR shift can we expect to be outsourced to Indian ALSPs? I think this is going like in Y2K, how Indian software companies could benefit. Is there something like that which can happen on LIBOR? It all depends on how much pressure is, or time pressure is, to kind of close things, and how much how much manual work is required, because when Y2K was, a lot of things were done on manual basis with knowledge which was not commonly present because of the old programming language. Now with AIML coming in, a lot of things can be done by machine, and you may not require to outsource anything to India. But having said it, Asaf, do you have any thoughts on this, on the question saying that what kind of work can be outsourced to Indian ALSPs?
Sure. So what I can say on that is, if you're taking a sort of fulsome approach and you have multiple documents, and people have been doing that, the big banks in the US have been on this for a while now. Smaller banks maybe less so, funds less so, but even if not now, there will come a time probably soon to really take on this task seriously. The time to do it is actually now. And when you think about everything that you need to do, part of it, an initial part of it is, we talked about assemble a team and think about it and keep up with the news, is to look at all your documents. So there's going to be a set of outside, to the extent you don't have it inside, sources. In addition to your lawyers, you may need a financial advisor and your an integral part of that surely is going to be a software company with a product that can scan and digitize if necessary, and using machine learning or other ways, scan for the relevant terms you need to look for in the document. And as I said, don't just take this software company to do it. You need legal input. And I'm not saying that to generate work for lawyers, right? It really is, we see that it really is important to have that input. But once you have that legal input, instead of an army of lawyers going through the documents, have the software do it. There are solutions like that in the US right now that are doing it and working with clients to do it. So that is a space that people can enter into, whether in India or otherwise. But there are existing solutions to that right now. But there's certainly a necessary role for a software company to help with the Libor transition effort.
Thank you, Asaf. Another interesting question which has come in, and maybe this will be the last question. Some of the questions we already answered on the chat box. Some questions we covered it during our discussion, but considering the time, we have already overshot the time. Last question from GB Blockchainer. Going ahead in the long future, how will central banks' digital currencies affect functioning of Libor and so forth? It's a very interesting question. Asaf, do you want to take a shot at this on how will digital currencies affect software?
I'm going to skip that one. It hasn't been really been discussed, and I'm not familiar enough with how blockchain and Libor intersect. I can just say that I haven't seen any kind of regulatory focus.
So let me address that, since I have a lot of interest in blockchain and cryptocurrencies, and as a firm, we have been working with cryptocurrencies from 2013, so last 7 years, and we have worked with almost all major cryptocurrency companies in India. That's why I found this question very interesting. I think, in my view, this Libor and SOFR are rates or benchmarks which has been done by the government institutions, banks, financial institutions. Most of the digital currency today operate outside the standard financial institution norms, right? So it's in one way. In fact, the whole objective why Bitcoin came in was because they had lost the trust of the US banking system because of 2008 situation, what happened, right? They had lost trust on that, and that's why the Bitcoin was kind of a reason or the product of that particular loss of trust, right? So in my view, most digital currencies are likely to remain outside the banking systems. And to the extent it will remain outside the banking systems, I don't think it will end up having any say in SOFR or any other benchmarks. Having said it, if the digital currency actually picks up, there may be interesting possibilities whereby they can come with something like that, like a parallel to SOFR. I don't think they will get backing of government. Libra itself did not get any backing of the government, so I don't think they will get a backing of the government. But if they start get backing of institutions, then it may be very interesting, interesting option or opportunity to see a competing or something which is outside the benchmark, which is outside the financial system, which may give you an alternative which you can use instead of SOFR or MIBOR or MIFOR or any other benchmark system, which is not governed by financial institutions. So this is interesting, but I don't think at this point of time anything likely to that is going to happen, not in near future for sure. With this, I think we have already exceeded time. I just want, I know Nishith Desai has joined our webinar, and I would like Nishith Bhai to kind of give vote of thanks to Asaf and say a few last words before we close the session.
Hi, hi Asaf, how are you? Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you. And it was very interesting discussion. I think nobody ever imagined that Libor will be on its way out, and even still India, people have no idea about what's happening. And so you brought major, I think, development across here. It has been very useful and educative to the whole financial community here, and possibly regulators as well. So I hope new solutions will be found, and certainly I think this will very much help everyone in all industries around. So I just want to thank. I don't want to take too much time. We already exceeded time substantially, but Vaibhav, Abhinav, and everybody around, please Vaibhav, of course, you did a good job, and thank you also once again. Really a pleasure working with you, and thank you.